Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a really thought-provoking piece of source material today. We're unpacking an August 25th devotional analysis by Pastor Huzi Chiang. Now, what makes this specific message so interesting is how deeply it draws on the writings of John MacArthur. It takes a very firm, completely unapologetic stance on modern faith. So we're going to break down Pastor Chiang's core arguments, look at his really vivid real-world metaphors, and dive into his sharp critique of contemporary church culture. All right, let's get right into it.
Let me ask you a question right off the bat. If your life were a road, would you choose the fast, smooth highway or the narrow, treacherous mountain pass? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, right? Human nature absolutely craves speed and comfort. But this metaphorical question sets up the absolute core tension of Pastor Chiang's message. He's highlighting that deep and honestly uncomfortable conflict between just seeking worldly comfort and pursuing difficult authenticity. And he argues this isn't just about your lifestyle. It's literally the defining spiritual choice of a lifetime.
So Section 1, two gates, two paths, a spiritual choice. Pastor Chiang's entire message really anchors itself on this strict, unavoidable binary choice.
And that brings us straight to the foundational scripture he uses. It's from Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. It reads, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." What's actually fascinating here is how Pastor Chiang frames this. He points out that Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount doesn't just, gently trail off at the end. It actively builds up to this massive climax. It's a call to action that forces the listener to make a concrete decision: accept God's path or stay right where you are in the comfortable world.
You can really see the stark contrast between these two gates. On one hand, you've got the wide gate. It accommodates the vast majority of people. It leans on broad worldly traditions. But the text is clear, it ultimately leads to destruction. And then, on the flip side, you have the narrow gate. You don't just stumble into it. It requires highly specific intent to find. It's small, and it represents God's incredibly strict internal standard of righteousness. Pastor Chiang makes it very clear there's absolutely no middle ground here. It's an exclusive path. Moving on to Section 2, highway versus suhua, a geographic metaphor. So how do we actually visualize this abstract theology? Pastor Chiang brilliantly uses local geography to nail this concept down. You see, Pastor Chiang lives in Hualien, over on the eastern coast of Taiwan, and he uses the transit systems there to make his point. He compares the transit on Taiwan's west coast with the east coast's Suha Highway. The West Coast is all high-speed rail and wide multi-lane highways. It's fast, it's super comfortable, you zip from Taipei to Kaohsiung in a matter of hours. But if you want to get to Hualien, you have to take the Suha Highway. It's this narrow, rugged road practically clinging to the mountainside. You're dealing with potential rock falls, constant traffic controls, road closures, the whole shebang. Pastor Chiang uses this to show that the Suha Highway is the narrow gate. Yes, it's difficult and unpredictable, but it is the absolute required path to reach the true destination. Meanwhile, that West Coast transit, that represents the easy, wide gate. So here is the crucial takeaway. Pastor Chiang links that comfortable wide road directly to our default human inclinations. It's literally built on what we naturally desire. When we're cruising down that wide road, we're just following the world's standard operating procedure, right? We're chasing status, racking up degrees, accumulating wealth. It doesn't require any sort of spiritual transformation because, well, it's exactly what human nature already wants to do anyway. All right, Section 3, the drowning man, a choice of survival. So what actually happens when someone cruising on that wide road realizes they're in trouble and needs saving? Pastor Chiang uses a second vivid metaphor to show how psychologically brutal it is to choose the narrow path. He asks us to picture a drowning man. First, imagine a person sinking in the waters of sin. Out of pure desperation, they grab onto a familiar floating plank. Now it's barely keeping their head above water, but it gives them this false sense of security. Then, suddenly, a divine rescue rope is tossed down from above. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. You cannot grab that rescue rope without first making the absolutely terrifying decision to let go of your familiar plank. Pastor Chiang is telling us that accepting the gospel requires that same terrifying leap, completely releasing your grip on old habits and false securities. And that leads right into Pastor Chiang's specific definition of the narrow gospel. He calls it a totally disruptive message. It is definitely not just some positive little affirmation you sprinkle on top of an already comfortable life. It actively challenges and shatters those deeply entrenched, normalized behaviors. We're talking about things like everyday dishonesty or low-level greed, which society constantly brushes off because, hey, everyone's doing it. The narrow gospel demands total surrender. It's about stripping away the old self entirely. Which brings us to Section 4, the consumer church trap, diluting the message. Keeping that strict definition in mind, Pastor Chiang pivots to a pretty sharp cultural critique. He looks at how modern churches deal with the difficulty of this narrow gate, and honestly, he does not pull his punches. He argues that a lot of churches today actively try to water down the message. They're essentially trying to widen the gate to make it easier to swallow. They end up treating the gospel like a direct sales pitch or some kind of insurance policy. They use commercial bait, like handing out gifts on Mother's Day or Father's Day just to get people in the door. They lean heavily on trendy, tailored programs like happiness groups that offer specific perks. And why do they do this? Pastor Kwong observes that there is this deep-seated fear of offending the attendees. They end up treating them more like customers who might just take their business to the church down the street. Now, you can really see the direct influence of John MacArthur on Pastor Chiang's thinking right here. Pastor Chiang warns that preaching with an apologetic attitude, sounding almost sorry that the gospel is so exclusive and difficult, completely guts its power. When a church practically apologizes for the strictness of the Bible, it reduces this divine, exclusive truth into nothing more than a cheap, customizable consumer product. So we arrive at Section 5, Return to Truth, the narrow gate. What's the actual alternative here? Let's take a look at a church that completely rejects this consumer model and leans hard into the narrow gate. Pastor Chiang points to his own experience with Beipu Church as the ultimate case study. When people visit Beipu Church, they're usually shocked by what they don't find. There are 0 Mother's Day or Father's Day gifts. There are no free love meals after the service designed to keep people lingering around. Instead, the environment is intensely focused. They put a massive, rigorous emphasis on adult Sunday school and deep biblical teaching. The whole goal is to cultivate authentic, spiritually disciplined fellowship by completely stripping away that commercial bait. It's a very minimalistic, highly intentional approach to faith. And that sets up this vital comparison. Pastor Chiang draws a massive line in the sand between consumer spirituality and authentic faith. Consumer spirituality is all about seeking comfort. It wants a church that caters to personal preferences, walks on eggshells, and carefully avoids ever bringing up sin. Authentic faith, on the other hand, embraces the uncomfortable. It actually welcomes the glaring, sometimes harsh light of clear biblical teaching because it knows that's what challenges the heart and sparks genuine transformation. It's quite literally the difference between being a customer and being a disciple. As we close out today's explainer, I want to pass on the exact same challenge that Pastor Chiang gives his audience. Are you seeking a comfortable path or the true gospel? When the teachings get really tough, when the light gets a bit too bright and the truth feels glaring, do you look for an exit ramp to an easier road, or do you step forward into it? It really forces us to examine the foundational reasons why we seek knowledge and faith in the first place. Thank you so much for joining me as we explore these concepts today. I definitely encourage you to keep reflecting on which gate you're choosing to enter. Catch you next time.